Thank you for joining us at the Competitive Advantage Talks presented by Kager, also known as the Craft Analytics Group. My name is Arsh Arora, and I'm an MBA student at MIT Sloan. It is my pleasure to introduce the presentation Predictive Analytics of Move Choice and Cheating Detection at Chess. Please join me in welcoming our speaker, Dr. Ken Regan, Professor of Computer Science at the University at Buffalo.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It is a great pleasure, and I look forward to meeting a lot of you. And so my work is joint with early work with the late Guy Howarth of Reading, United Kingdom, and with students, including my doctoral student, Tamal Bishwash, and my work is supported by free computing time given by the Center for Computation Research at University at Buffalo. I can't see which slide is up. I'm sorry. Okay, I can on this. Okay, so I can signal from my first slide, predictive analytics. So I use what Wikipedia calls a granular definition of predictive analytics. It addresses a situation where you have various options or possible outcomes, MI, at various times, or in my case, game turns T. And what the model does is place a probability on each of those options. And then once you have the probabilities, please advance slide, you can project risk and reward quantities associated to the outcomes. In the case of chess, those, the value of the position tell you your chances of winning the games. But for myself, I use an even more granular definition. I want there also to be confidence intervals on those projected probabilities because I'm going to use them for the statistics needed to judge unlikelihood of series of moves that might represent cheating at the game. So here's a game situation, a crucial position from the 2008 World Championship match in which white has 5 options. There's also a connection to the study of SAT GRE type tests. And here, Kramnik failed the test by capturing the pawn with his knight. We'll see that in a moment. Okay, next slide. Okay, so I use a simple econometric type model, not a neural model. The original model of that kind by Daniel McFadden was a log linear multinomial logit model. And that could work for some things, but it does not work in chess. It gets other predictions wrong. So I use a double log linear model involving the ratio, not the difference, of the logarithms of the probabilities of a given move and the best move, P1. I'm going to order the moves. So where do I get the best move from? So one difference, by the way, the more standard approach represents the other probabilities as multiples of the best move probability. In mine, they come out as powers of the probability of the best move. But what is the best move anyway? Next slide. Okay, so that's judged by strong computer programs to begin with. So I'm literally fighting fire with fire. So what happened in this case was Kramnik fell into a deep trap set by Vishwanathan Anand as black. Can white's knight take that pawn? On first blush, no, black's queen will take it, and the computer gives negative values in the bottom row. But if you look a little more, white's rook could then come over and attack the queen, and if the queen moves away, get black's knight back and cause havoc. But wait, black can counterattack. Black can move the knight and attack white's queen. Take, take, take. And we get a situation where white's still able to go and get the bishop, and Kramnik thought, oh good, I'm a pawn ahead. But Anand had sown something really deep with the knight, and the computer in column 15 only sees it at a fairly high depth of search. So I use all these values. The end values are the judgment values. The other values are for the predictivity component. Okay, next slide. Thank you. So once this is taken into account, there's only one equation in the model that uses 3 parameters for the player. 1, how sensitive is the player to small differences in value, to accumulating small changes? That's strategic ability, like Anatoly Karpov. Then C is how consistent. How does the player avoid making large errors, which you need for tactical minefields, like Mikhail Tal. And then there's a third parameter I've had real trouble controlling that I use only in cases, and it governs the influence of those earlier depth moves. Apart from those three parameters and the move values, my model knows nothing about chess. It's just econometrics. Next slide. Yet it's able to do pretty well. And here are the main quantities that I project in order to do, in particular, the cheating tests that I will describe. So the best move comes from a computer to begin with. How many times does the player make the same best move as the computer? That's commonly called T1 match. Now, the probabilities put by my model are trained on human play. So the PIs tell you how often a human player with given parameters corresponding to a chess rating is going to imitate the computer. And obviously, if the player imitates more, that's when we might get a little suspicious. Okay, so we just add up the probabilities projected for P1 move at all the game turns T. Then there's equal value to optimal move. And then on moves that are not the best move, how much of an error are they? What's their delta in value? So VI minus VT is delta. Okay? So we project those, and then if we make a slightly but not too false assumption that the game decisions are independent, we can also get confidence intervals for these quantities, variances, and so forth. So then, in order to train my model, I solve the three equations and three unknowns that make these unbiased estimators over a large data set. And I have large data sets for players of each ELO rating from beginner to champion. And I use those to project these quantities. And the model has very good conformance to a normal curve. But wait, I got to define some terms first. So let's talk about chess ratings. Next slide. Okay. So this is an idea that's used in other areas of sports analytics as well. You may hear it elsewhere in the non-chess part of the conference, but it was begun in chess by the Hungarian-American statistician Arpad Elo with the idea that 1500 is a median player and standard deviation class interval about 200 points. Nate Silver used this scheme for ratings for various sports at 538. Okay, so in chess, 1,000 to 2,000 are amateur ranks, 2,200 is a master. I am an international master nearer to 2,400, but not quite a grandmaster. The world's elite players are 2,800. But computers are 700, 800 points higher. And by this curve, which gives the probability of winning based on the difference in rating, it means computers can wipe the floor with us, which is why there's a great incentive to want to cheat with computers. Okay, so this curve has real predictive value, and that's how it's used for setting odds at various sports. Okay, and rating players and judging players' chances of winning games. And it worked very well for a while, but next slide. Okay, the rating system got out of whack even before the pandemic. So the black curve is what was on the previous page, what it should be. But underdogs were doing too well. And that's because there was an issue with ratings, but then that got completely trumped by the pandemic when official ratings were frozen. And that's the white line at the very bottom, which is way off in the top chart. And here's an example player. So coming on 2 years ago, a young Indian teenage lady traveled to Europe. Her rating was 1845 on the wall chart, and she beat several people rated near 2400. And people thought she must be cheating. And this came around to me. However, if you look at the chart, the line going across is ratings being frozen by the pandemic. If you project her natural growth curve, then you would have her near 2,300. And I actually implemented a formula based on growth curves of young players to do exactly that. Once you got to Europe, where ratings were better mixed because in-person chess had returned more, and that's the chess that the International Chess Federation rates, her rating rapidly adjusted. Okay, and so I'm, by the way, in the midst of a long model retraining because ratings have to stabilize from the correction that was made to solve the top problem, and then ratings recovering from the pandemic. Okay, next slide. Okay, so given that, here there are two workflows in my model. There's one important distinction here. So I can take a player's rating and I generate the projections. And the important point is I'm not regressing on the small data of the player's own games. I'm making my projection based on large data from my training sets of hundreds of thousands of games played by players of all ratings. I generate the projected move, match, and error, and then tally it against the actual, and I make a z-score as actual minus projected divided by the standard deviation. Okay? And that actually conforms well to a bell curve over non-cheating players. The other workflow in the other direction is I take the games and judge the quality on the ELO scale of how they play. So I solve for the parameters that best match the player, and then I apply those parameters to a standardized test, because the player's own games may have been more difficult or they may have been really easy. And how well the fitted player does on the standardized test gives the intrinsic performance rating. Okay, next slide. So the z-scores said they conform to a bell curve, and this is a standard diagram, not specific to my research at all. A z-score does not say likelihood of cheating. What the z-score means, it's the natural frequency of a deviant or of an outlier event. Okay, so if I say 2 sigma, then that happens 1 in 44 times approximately. So a player may play 2 sigma up, but if there are 50 players in a tournament, chances are I'm going to see a 2 sigma up performance anyway. 3 sigma is about 1 in 750 times. Well, in a very large tournament, I'm going to see one of those as well. You really need 4 or 5 sigma. 5 sigma has a face value frequency of 1 in 3.5 million. But that even is not the odds of cheating. There's Bayesian reasoning and other look elsewhere effect reasoning that I have on an alternate slide, which I can say more about in the Q&A. But that's the basic rigging of the outputs of my model and how to interpret them. So let me talk about 3 cases in practice. I can't talk about recent cheating cases, but next slide. So my first big international case was in 2011 with an early but still full-formed version of my model. This was a player 5th board on the French chess team, Sebastian Feller. This is a confessed case. He had an accomplice on site and an accomplice in Paris who was getting communications and playing the moves on a strong computer program. Okay. So on the 4 confessed games where there was cheating through most of the games, I get a z-score of nearly 3 and intrinsic performance of 3,000. I've left the error bars off on this slide. They're on the next slide. Just to say that the error bars and the IPRs are not to be used to make inferences because they're error bars of measurement on small data. But the z equals 3, yeah, that's supposed to be inferred. Now, wait a second. The Olympiad had more than 1,000 people playing in both the men's and women's sections. So z equals 3 wouldn't mean anything by itself. But there was on-site evidence of something fishy going on. And moreover, I got a very strong distinction to the other 5 games. In fact, he even performed worse than his 2650 rating. Another case, 2 years later, Borislav Ivanov was the first time I ever got a z-score of 5 as output of my model. And it took a long time, but FIDE now does allow verdicts of of cheating from statistics alone. Not even sure I completely agree with that. It has to be taken on a case-by-case basis. But far more often, my model exonerates an accused player. And this is basically how it happens. My very first case, the one that spurred me to do this work, was in the World Championship match of 2006, when the Bulgarian player, Topalov, accused Vladimir Kramnik of getting moves by internet cable to his toilet. Okay. And his evidence was very high concordance statistics to the reigning program Fritz 9 of that day. Now, I skipped saying this T1 match over the range of players basically goes from 35% matching to a computer for beginners to 60% matching by the world's best players. But the letter showed 90% matching. I reproduce 80%. However, on the particular moves, including of one of the games, my model actually projects over 80% matching, because a lot of those game positions were with only one clear-cut move to stay alive. And when that's the case, chances are a strong player like Kramnik and a computer will find the same move. That's exactly what my model does, and the econometric equations I showed actually do that. Okay, so very often when there's an anomalous performance by a young player, by a lower player, it's very often that the opponents made it easy for that player. Okay, next slide. Okay, so this gets me, this is my last three slides. So this gets me to the topic of estimating the growth rates of players, especially young players. There were many more besides the case I talked about of the young Indian lady who were accused. Okay. So that's what I use IPR for. So this is a notorious case. I'm staying away from the most controversial aspects, but the growth curve of the American Hans Niemann, who was accused by Magnus Carlsen of cheating in a one-off game. And one of the issues is that at the right-hand side of the blue dots, he seemed to have a very sudden rise from my, not much above me level of play to world elite level of play. And notice, incidentally, at far left, he had a plateau too. I did. I was a young player, and I stagnated in the 2200s for 3 years before having my last spurt. But the other blue line, that was the pandemic. That was not a plateau. So I measured his intrinsic performance ratings, and they follow a fairly good diagonal line of steady progress. It was just not reflected in his official rating. Okay, so therefore, my work can be used for player development, can also be used to set betting lines for chess moves, and for other questions, such as what happens to older players like me, or how does skill at fast chess correlate with slow chess? Just like Bill James said, comparing between historical eras, you can do that for chess as well. And maybe I'll get into this, when and why does the gender gap in chess appear? Okay, next slide, last main slide. So how does thinking time affect quality at chess? Well, your initial time budget has a big effect. So I've measured that rapid chess, 25 minutes to turn 60, decreases you by 240 plus or minus 25 points, and blitz chess almost 600, standard 5-minute blitz chess. But when we talk about the amount of time used at slow chess, I get some fairly weird results, unexpected results maybe, although others had similar results before. If you're playing slow chess, but you took only 5 minutes for your move, it means you were really confident. And I measure you playing amazingly, 700, 900, even 1,000 points higher. Whereas if you took 10 or more minutes, it's a sign of difficulty. And I measure the actual quality as being 600, 800 points lower. And the most important paper in my references there is Sunder, Strittmatter, and Zegner's 2022. And in their introduction, they make the same point as my bottom point, that this runs counter to Daniel Kahneman's hypothesis about the general value of system 2 thinking. In System 2 chess, maybe it's not able to deal with the difficulty. System 2 means thinking slow, thinking for a long time. Okay? And with that, advance to my last slide. And so there are three main takeaways from this talk. I have a simple frequentist model that's nevertheless been highly effective, and it might reflect some underlying laws of thought. There are cross-validation things which I can talk about further, and then the other question is, how well does this carry over? How do these laws of thought matter in other fields? Other games should be, but even in large language models where you're trying to find the best next word instead of the best next move. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Regan. We will have about 5 minutes for questions. I will walk over to you with this mic. Please raise your hand if you have a question.
Do you think it's realistic and or useful to train your model on smaller data sets for individual players as well, to take into account their style or like a particularly attacking or defensive player?
Yeah, that's a great and very difficult question, and it's addressed in my last paper with Howarth and Biswash in 2015 at the ICGA, International Computer Games Journal, called Profiling Prediction Performance. So I call that profiling a player. The problem is it's very small data. There is the Play Magnus app, which I've wanted to study, that supposedly was trained on games that Magnus Carlsen played at various ages in his development. And so yes, there are many questions of that kind. Can you use my model to simulate a player on having trained on his or her games? Yes, all these are great questions. But I have to be extra sure with my pronouncements, so I can't base, human rights level accusations of cheating on small data. But profiling can be used as a defense in a proceedings, yes. Okay.
Any more questions?
Hi, you put a bullet point on gender gap, and
yeah, go to the last slide.
Yeah, forgive me for a very basic
There
question.
are three slides after. No, back. Sorry, after the final slide, there are three other slides. Okay, cross-validation,
okay.
Next one, and next one. Yes, okay.
Yeah, forgive me for the basic question, but I guess, is there a gender gap, and what's the prevailing theory on why that might be?
Yes, well, there's no women in the top 100 anymore since Judith Polgar retired, and Hao Yifan basically also is not playing as much. And that's a big thing of study. So, what age does the gap begin? My data is consistent with the boring answer. It's 13, 14. But the question is this a nature versus nurture thing? So one thing that happened in the pandemic, which you may hear more about from chess.com, is chess had to go online where people played it faster. And my results hint that that's just as good for training your mind as playing slow chess tournaments in person. So, but when you're online, there might be statistics of how much time you spent online. So is it simply the case that the average boy spent more time than the average girl? And that actually could yield a testable hypothesis. The data is not available, I'm told.
One more question?
Sure.
Yeah, this wouldn't really apply to cheating as much, I guess, but have you ever thought about applying a lot of what you did to other, like 1v1 sports? Like, I'm thinking about like tennis, for instance, where you could power rank and have kind of predictive models of play?
In principle, yes. There's one aspect of this. My model separates prediction from performance metric. So with tennis, if I only had results of matches, I'd have less power compared to chess, where I can use other factors for prediction. However, if I had data on the development of stroke, then yes, this kind of approach might work.
All right, that's all the time we have, unfortunately. Thank you, Dr. Regan, again, for the insightful presentation.
Okay.